Okay, hello there. This is Dr. Barbary, and this is Action Research for Teachers. This is the first class. This will probably be one of the longer classes that we've got just because there's a lot of content to cover. Not everyone will work like this, but this kind of lays the foundation. So, anyway, and there are times, going through it where you may see me looking, over here. You may see me looking over there. You may see me looking down. Not trying to be unengaged, but just going between notes and things like that. So if you see me looking around, just look at this shiny spot on the top of my head, and that'll keep you nice and focused. So let's go ahead and get started. Going and looking at action research, you have to approach it like it's a particular body of inquiry. Now, going and looking at anything, you have what is called a paradigm. It's basically a framework that informs the way the body of knowledge is constructed. This applies no matter what discipline you're talking about. You have particular paradigms of thought in medicine, in law, in education, in philosophy. Name the discipline, and I can promise you there is some kind of framework that makes it up. So let's look at this definition real quick. A set of assumptions, concepts, values, and practices that constitutes a way of viewing reality for the community that shares them, especially in an intellectual discipline. The advantage to something like this is it gives cohesion to a particular body of thought. Another way of putting that is it ties up loose ends. If you know the value of different parts of a setting and how they interrelate with one another, it helps you understand it better. It's like looking at the human body. You understand what everything does. It just helps you to understand, more about it. I love this quote. Thank you, Albert Einstein. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Here's the thing. Whenever people go and look at research, they tend to look at it in a particular way because they think that research means a certain something. What this quote gets at is in looking at a particular setting that you want to understand more about, you may not be looking at that setting in a traditional fashion the way others have that have come before you. You may have to step back and take a different look at it. And this is a really good illustration of qualitative forms of inquiry, which we'll talk about more as we go on. Okay? Now, in going and looking at any kind of research, history is always important. I know you've heard the old quote of those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. When you're looking at any form of research that is conducted or any kind of instructional improvement, things like that, it's good to have a sense of where you came from. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. The positivist era is something that came post-Enlightenment in Europe, post-Enlightenment, post-Reformation, and it's very heavily tied to the Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s. Now, the deal with this is positivism means that in going and looking at the way something is put together, you can understand how to make it work in a more efficient way by adjusting the way it's put together. As an example, take a look at the way a car is made, or take a look at the way an iPhone is made, or even a hamburger. If you go and put the constituent parts one after another so that they can be assembled the same way every time, you're talking about a product coming out that is reliable. It is always going to be the same. You can count on how it will perform. Now, you could look at this and say, okay, that could be a pretty good thing because you always want a McDonald's Big Mac to taste the same, and you want your car to start up every time you go and get into it to go somewhere. And if it does break down, you would like to be able to easily figure out, or the mechanic to figure out, what is needed to fix it. Okay? That is positivist kinds of thinking. You want it to be predictable and reliable every time. Now, it's easy to understand why, looking at positivism, how if you show a particular process to be predictable and work over and over again, how you would want to graft that onto education. I mean, it's easy to see that. The difference is that people are more dynamic than processes of manufacture. And so that is where, positivism was certainly grafted onto education, but it was not without its discontents. John Dewey would be a good example of one, who, said that we're more than just some, assemblage of parts in the way that we organize information in the world. So that led to a different way of thinking, the post-positivist era. Now, when I'm talking about these different eras, and something that's important to know is that it's not that everyone in society was thinking of it at that same time. There were lots of different forms of thought, but when you're going and looking at these, you're talking about what was the most influential in society at that time. So the post-positivist era went from the Industrial Revolution up through the 1960s. There was a lot of change going on, socially speaking, in terms of civil rights, in terms of the rights of workers, in terms of women's suffrage. It was just a time of dramatic social change. Now, what social researchers began to realize during this time was that there were limits, or not began to realize, maybe they acknowledged would be a better way to put it, that there were limits to positivism. Now, this doesn't mean that they just shucked aside everything that positivism was about. What they began to do was look at it in terms of its limitations and say, well, if it's only good up to this point, what about this area in here? How do we then go and take a look at it? And so positivism began to be reimagined, in essence. Okay? Diversity and equity issues of the 1970s and 1980s encouraged alternative methods of research. And we'll talk about different kinds of methods of research more as this presentation goes on. But this is something that's very important to understand, because when you hit the limits of a particular paradigm, some people are inclined to do away with it. Some people want to reimagine it. The way research works generally is it tends to be reimagined. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, going and looking at quantitative and qualitative forms of research, there is a perception that they are two very different paradigms. Now, this is only partially true. Quantitative inquiry, quantitative results are generally driven by statistics, by percentages. It's something that's number driven, and it is seen as an objective science. As an example, okay, notions of reality when it comes to quantitative thought. Okay, reality is single, it's tangible. There may be different perceptions of it depending on which context you go to, but it is, the sky is blue around the world, water is wet around the world, different people have different roles in society around the world. Now, all of those may change a bit from place to place, but they are what they are. Okay? The relationship of the knower to the known, or a better way to put that would be the relationship of the researcher to their reality. It's independent. Okay? It is something that is dualistic. I am the researcher. The people that or the setting that I am there to research is what it is, and so I am not tied into them. How generalizable is something? Okay, meaning if you draw results from a particular study that you do, how easy is it to take the results from study in setting A and then apply those results to setting B and setting C? And should you be able to generalize across these different settings? People would argue, yes, you should be able to. Others would argue that you should not. Okay? What kind of causation do you have? you have cause and effect, and in quantitative forms of thought, it is something that is linear. That's it. My nose itched, so I rubbed it. I'm thirsty, so I get a drink of water. It's a cause and effect kind of an approach. The role of values. Quantitative is seen as being value free. You are trained in a specific discipline to go and look objectively at something and analyze it and come to a conclusion. Now, that's the quantitative parts of this. The qualitative parts of this, and this is where the little bit of the misunderstanding comes into the picture. Elliot Eisner, who I will cover later on in this presentation, has a really good take on qualitative research. He states that it is sufficiently broad so as to be able to encompass quantitative forms of inquiry. Meaning, you don't have this setting where qualitative is all over here and quantitative is all over here. And there's this gulf between them that cannot be traversed. That is not the case. Think of quantitative not as the center, but just as a certain part. Qualitative is that which can go out beyond its limits. Okay? It's how you go and you look at settings that are a little bit more complicated than simply being numeric. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of it. Qualitative forms of reality they look at as they're multiple. They are constructed by their participants. They are very, very much value laden, so that what constitutes sweet in one culture, like sugar, sweet, will be different in another. Okay, the relationship of the knower to the known. The researcher and the researched are interdependent. They are not something that is separate. That is a fundamental assertion in qualitative research. Generalizability, meaning can you go and take the results of a study and can you go and apply it to setting A, B, and C? Well, they'll say no for qualitative research. You go and you conduct your study, you come up with results through analysis. Now, there may be some that you can go and transfer from one setting to another, but you should not assume that it will be some kind of a blanket transfer. You acknowledge the fact that it is a particular time and context that you are studying. Meaning, if I'm going to study third period math, it's going to be different from one semester to the next and 1 year to the next. One teacher to the next. The little factors matter. It's not just one static kind of a space that's built and it never changes. Okay? Causation. Instead of being linear, it is more simultaneous. You have the effects of different members of a setting on each other. And so that's where causation comes from. It's almost like a lava lamp. You see them going up and you see them coming down, and the movement of each one affects others that they encounter. And then the role of values. It is very much value bound. And that is not recognized as something that is bad at all. It is just part of the human experience. Okay, so the nature of reality, going and looking at it from a paradigmatic perspective. Reality is a continuum with different features. This reflects a particular worldview that a person may have. Now, you have philosophers that argue, what is reality? Is it objective? Is it perceived? Is it constructed, or is it created? Objective reality just means that reality is out there, and we are independent of it, but we participate in it. There you have it. Perceived reality means that it is what you take in through a sensory experience. And so what is warm to me may be cold to you. What is very sunny and bright to me may not be to you. What I perceive as being dangerous in the environment, you may not. It's all perceived. Okay? Constructed reality is just that. People go and build in their different parts to, their social landscape, their jobs, their family roles, what it is that they're here to do. The reason that a community is laid out in a certain fashion, things like that. Okay, created reality, a lot like constructed reality, but created is more from the perspective of the individual. And this is something that is, if you want to do some reading on postmodernism, pretty interesting stuff. The Postmodern Condition is a book by Jean-Francois Lyotard, and his take on it is that you have so many different groups that have so many different ideas about reality that the population is literally fragmented. And there are lots of things that they have in common, but lots of things that they have that are very different from one another. And because of this, they literally create their own forms of reality. Kind of an interesting topic, huh? Okay, now, going and looking at the relationship of the researcher to the researched, okay, or, when I say researched, I'm talking, maybe it's classroom setting, maybe it's an individual. It'll depending on the researcher and the particular research question. In quantitative forms of thought, they are independent. If I am there to go and conduct a focus group with a number of students, then I am going to ask them their questions, or my questions, and I'm going to write down and record what they have. And the fact that I am there will not have any impact on how they respond. Okay, that's a basic assumption. With a qualitative approach to this, the researcher and the researched interact with each other and influence each other. As an example, let's say that there's a group of 10 college-age males, and they are part of a focus group, and you have someone come in that is younger than them. Obviously, they don't take him to look as experienced as they are. Maybe he's 15 or 16 years old, and he asks them these focus group questions. Now, they're going to respond to him in a certain way. Let's take and change that, and let's say that there is an attractive young lady that comes in and asks the same questions. Okay? How would they respond to her? Now, the idea here is that, the researcher's job, their only job is just to collect this data. That's all they're there to do. But in qualitative forms of thought, whenever you have two parties that occupy a space, they influence each other. Now, here we're talking about age, we're talking about maybe the level of attraction, but think about this. Go and look at look at how people or how students perceive effective teachers. What are some of the characteristics that they have? How do you go and you define appropriate kinds of behavior according to a student? What is considered to be overly masculine? What is considered to be overly feminine? What is, and the spectrum that exists there. Okay? Remember, the basic assumption here is that with quantitative forms of thought, they're separate. They don't need each other, and they have no influence on each other. With qualitative, they shape each other. And so there's this acknowledgement that there's influence through the course of the collecting data. An important thing to remember. Okay. The applicability of the findings for quantitative versus qualitative research. Okay, both certainly have a population, okay, that they go and look at. Here's where it gets a little bit different. With quantitative forms of thought, whenever you want to go and research a problem, you want a random sample, meaning you want the sample that you select for a setting to have you want it to be representative of the demographic of that setting in terms of, age, gender, ethnicity, language diversity, things like that. Okay? With qualitative forms of research, and I say this in terms of action research, you want it to be a purposeful sample. So instead of it just being, something that is random and you don't know who you're going to get, you want it to be indicative of this particular setting. Okay? Now, with quantitative, you should be able to take the results and you should be able to generalize it back to the entire population. With qualitative, you recognize that there are limitations to that. So you can't really apply it to every single individual that's there. Time and context free, that's quantitative. So it won't matter if we research this now in 2013 and then again in 2018, we should find roughly the same thing if the conditions are similar. Versus qualitative, so when we go and look at this now in 2013, we could look at it in 2018 and we know it's going to be different because there are lots of little subtle things that have changed along the way. Okay, so the nature of causation. We've kind of gone over this, but we'll cover it again just real quick. Okay, with quantitative, you're talking about cause and effect. It is something that is predictable, something that is linear. When you're talking about qualitative, it is mutual. One thing informs the other. So, you can't always predict what is going to happen. You can observe when it does. You can try and predict because that's just what human beings do, but you understand that there is a real limitation to that. Okay, again, the role of values. With quantitative, it is value free. With qualitative, you're talking about values being brought to it. The researcher bringing their values for what kinds of things they're looking at, what kinds of questions they may ask, what is the purpose for the study in itself. The respondent's values, how do they respond to a particular kind of an individual? What kind of information do they believe is worth sharing in the first place? The values of the particular context that is being studied. If you're talking about a particular grade level, let's say it's 8th grade math, is the context of this going to be different in a rural versus suburban versus urban setting? Would it be different in two rural settings? Readers' values. Inevitably, when research comes out, someone has to be there to consume it. So what kinds of values are readers going to bring? Okay, so factors involved in conducting qualitative research. Excuse me, I'm going to scoot my chair up here. Okay. Now you have, this is just kind of a general list, but I think it's helpful in going and looking at what kinds of things go into a project. It is considered a natural setting. Especially when you're talking about action research being focused on a classroom or some kind of an organizational setting, you can't extract that from the place in which it occurs. You need the natural setting because it will give you the most authentic data and most authentic results. The human instrument. We are intuitive creatures. We are problem solving in our nature, and so we are good to have as a part of this entire process. Tacit knowledge of the setting. So if I am a researcher, and let's say, if you're a teacher and you're going to be researching some part of your class, you may think you know your class inside and out, but accepting that you have tacit knowledge of the setting means that you don't know every single individual in that classroom. You don't know how they relate to each other. So accepting the fact that there are limitations is seen as an advantage because it's more authentic. Okay? Qualitative methods. For purposes of this class, what you're going to be doing is conducting interviews. You'll be conducting observations. So it's not something that is strictly statistically driven. Can you do those things? Absolutely you can. But you also have other ways that you collect data. Okay? Purposive sampling, meaning when you choose the folks that are going to be represented in a particular study, you choose them on purpose, and you do so for a very good reason. If you want to know what kind of peer pressure there is in class to act a certain way, who are you going to ask those questions to? Maybe The most popular kids may be the wallflowers, maybe kids that sort of have a counterculture thing going with them. All of the above. Something to think about. Inductive data analysis, meaning this is not something that is linear. You look at the fact that when you collect this different data and you analyze it, one thing informs another. That's very, very important to keep in mind. Emergent design is another area. What this means is when you go through to do a particular kind of an investigation and you know or you come to learn that what you are doing will not get you the data that you need, you're not asking the right questions, change your questions up. Okay? That's a strength in qualitative kinds of inquiry. The case study reporting mode. If you remember earlier, we said that you understand and accept the fact that you are studying one time, one context. So reporting that in terms of it being a case study, you can go and read the case study. You can learn lots of things from the case study. You just don't assume that that case study relates to every place, everywhere, every time, every student. A tentative application, kind of related to the case study case study reporting. It is time and context bound. So the results that you have certainly apply to this setting, but you don't assume that it's going to be across the board. Okay? And then there's special criteria for trustworthiness. And we'll talk about trustworthiness more as we go on through the class. Okay? Here's some basic types of qualitative inquiry. Sometimes when people go and look at a list like this, basic inquiry, historical inquiry, ethnographic inquiry, philosophical inquiry, on down the line, they think, oh my gosh, this paradigm is huge. How can you do this? The only thing I'm asking you to do for this particular class is the last one, action research. That's it. Now, what happens a lot of times is researchers like a particular kind of an inquiry. I have conducted myself mixed methods forms of research. I've also conducted ethnographic inquiries. Have I done something that was phenomenological or hermeneutic? No, I have not. Does that mean that I can't do that? Absolutely not. That just hasn't been an area of interest so far. Okay? But these are very interesting areas. Just as an aside, hermeneutic inquiry, you're talking about interpretation, text. That actually comes from the Reformation. It's a European idea because, when back at this point in history, when people would go and read and interpret the Bible, the only ones that could read and interpret it were the literate ones. Now, if you go and you have a particular Bible that is read and interpreted, do people draw different meanings from it? Yeah, they do. So these different areas, they're very interesting. So if something tweaks your interest, I say pursue it. See where you land. Okay? We come back to Elliot Eisner. These are what I consider to be some really good thoughts to start to bring this lecture to a little bit of a close. Okay? There are multiple ways in which the world can be known. Artists, writers, dancers, as well as scientists have important things to tell about the world. You have to have many flavors in order to understand a larger picture. And so strictly having someone that is a mathematician or a statistician say, or make observations or judgments where maybe, artists, writers, and dancers would be better qualified. I think it's an obvious conclusion where you come to there. Human knowledge is a constructed form of experience and therefore a reflection of mind as well as nature. Knowledge is made, not simply discovered. Okay? So the important part there is that it is a constructed form of experience. So we're all working together collectively in overlapping ways. The forms through which humans represent their conceptions of the world have a major influence on what they are able to say about it. Think of the language that is used in order to go and make certain kinds of observations, or even the art that comes about in order to say something about a particular social context or a series of events. Okay? Here's some other good areas that he refers to. Educational inquiry will be more complete and informative as we increase the range of ways we describe, interpret, and evaluate the educational world. If you go and draw the ultimate value of education and base that strictly on what a standardized test has to say, you're severely limiting yourself. There are lots of different factors to go and look at. You know that because you're teachers. But the idea is that when people approach this, they need to approach it holistically. Okay? Which particular forms of representation become acceptable in the educational research community is as much a political matter as an epistemological one. New forms of representation, when acceptable, will require new competencies. And action research is actually an excellent example of this. It wasn't always called action research. You know, action research is considered to be the kind of research that you conduct, that you have a real action that you execute as a result of having completed it. Is something that is actually not that old at all. I think it dates back just to the 1960s, 1970s. But it is a good way to describe it is that it is codified and structured common sense that seeks to go and gather information to make a better and more informed analysis and decision. All right, features of qualitative inquiry. Okay, our sensory system is very important. Here's where we go back to the notion of the human instrument. You can't go and get away from that at all. When you go and you look at the ability to experience qualities, okay, this requires more than them just being there in the room. It also requires a certain perception of what they are, which differs according to the individual, according to the time that they're in, the context that they're in, their own values, etc. Okay? Qualitative inquiry is not only directed towards those aspects of the world out there, it is also directed to objects and events that we were able to create. So when we go and create a particular school of thought or a particular subject that is worth studying in class, well, this is something that should go along with that, because you don't just birth an idea and let it go. It's always subject to reflection, self-examination. One of the most useful forms of qualitative inquiry is found in literature. Now, this is where the hermeneutics comes back into the picture. It is literally the science of interpretation. Okay? You have different kinds of texts. And this is actually a concept that I've read from William Pinar. He used to be a curriculum theorist at Louisiana State University. His idea was that all different kinds of things can be text. The curriculum that you study is text. Political ads are text. Music is text. Standardized tests are text. Even someone that is a spoken word artist, that is itself a form of text, because all these things represent some kind of information that you take in and that you have to make sense of. And if you take this from the perspective of the student, I'm in school, I'm having to go and take in this information that the teacher is sending out. What kind of sense am I supposed to make of it? It is also has to settle in with my value system as it is at that point. So, yeah, big area. We'll come back to more of that later, I promise. I don't want to give too much of the spoiler away. Okay? Implications for appraising what is researched. Okay? It requires appraising education in ways akin to those in which critics appraise novels, films, poetry, and art. It requires judgment. In essence, you have to be a connoisseur of a particular area. If you really like a one-way lecture, but you are there to observe a Socratic dialogue, is there a problem? I would hope not, unless you were so embedded in a one-way lecture-driven approach that the Socratic dialogue just didn't make sense to you. But it's like eating fine food. You just have to like the taste to know what you're going to run into and run across. Okay? When teachers become teacher researchers, we're talking about the way that this translates into classrooms. Something very, very important. Because I don't want this to be, well, this is that class I took and this is that research project that I had to do. I don't want that at all. That what I want for you is to come away with a certain way of seeing your classrooms that you didn't have before. Okay? Traditional descriptions of both teachers and researchers change. If you go and look at the way research is seen by a lot of folks now, teacher doesn't count as researcher. Teacher counts as someone that is just there to deliver the curriculum. The tests and researchers are other people that come in and do jobs. That changes. Teacher researchers raise questions about what they think and observe about their teaching and their students' learning. So there's this constant element of reflection and self-examination that takes place. That is necessary. It has to be a part of it because it makes the experience and the setting more authentic. They collect student work in order to evaluate performance. But, and here's where I leave that off on purpose, when they go and collect it to evaluate, are they collecting this and evaluating it to see how the student did, how they taught, how the content translated, or is it a mixture of all of those? They also see student work as data to analyze in order to examine teaching and learning which produced it. Okay? Again, self-examination. So what kinds of things do teacher researchers do? You can take a look at this and you see that it helps in embracing something like this. You are literally developing a particular voice, a particular approach that may be different from what you have done in the past. It is something that is proactive. It is not reactive. It's not just doing it because you're worried that test scores may go down or an administrator may be on your back about something. You're wanting to be proactive and to improve things. It's just that it's not like you're going through a dark room and trying to do this in a strictly intuitive way. You're also going and gathering the kinds of data that will help you know what kinds of questions to ask and if maybe you're looking at this in the right way. Okay? So this is the end of the first lecture. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to email me. There will be a forum discussion that will be posted as a result of this. And so, make sure that you go and take a look at the module for the instructions to that. But anyway, I will talk to you next time. Have a good one.